phase number 10 of 10, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to create our game over state. We are able to shoot enemies, and enemies are able to attack us, but we currently want to show the player when the game has ended, apart from just having you kind of fall over. So we're going to do that by creating a bunch of other UI elements, I should say. So the first thing I'm going to do is to click on the 2D mode of the scene view, and then I'm going to double click my HUD canvas to frame selected as before. Remember that is shortcut F. If you wanted to do that instead, you can click on any object and F to frame it. And I'm just zooming in to fill my screen. And I'm going to right click that HUD canvas and go to UI and image. So we're going to create an image that stretches over the entire HUD canvas, the entire screen, and we're going to fade it out. So rename this from image to screen fader. Screen fader, capital S and F. Then in the rect transform anchor presets, click the button, and we're going to alt click the lower right preset, which is stretch in both dimensions. That will stretch it over the entirety of the canvas, and currently because it's white, it will just block everything out. Then what we're going to do is in our image script, I'm going to click on the color block, and I'm going to pick a shade of light blue, something like this. So we're not going to pick a shade of black. We want to see our drop shadow on our score and our game over. I'm going to pick a light blue. So one more time. Right click the HUD canvas, create a UI image. In the rect transform component, we are alt clicking stretch both in the lower right of the anchor presets. In the image component, all I've done there is set the color block to a light shade of blue.
It's a very nice color.
Thank you very much. You're very kind.
You're welcome.
Okay. Then we need to add our game over message. So yet again, reselect the HUD canvas. Right click, UI, text. As before, it's going to create it right in the center of that. We're going to rename this game over text. Capital G, O, and T. Wrong way.
Get the mic off in time. Sorry about that.
Cool. Then what we're going to do is make sure that it's centered perfectly. So we're going to alt click the center preset. It should be centered anyway, but we're just making sure. Then I'm going to change my width to 300 and a height of 50. So we've made a text component, right clicking the HUD canvas, UI, text. Then we've renamed it game over text. And in the rect transform, the preset we set it to, if it wasn't already, is by alt clicking center middle. The width is 300 and the height is 50. Then we're going to write in an actual message. In the text component, we're going to say game over. Though I'm sure you can come up with something more creative than that.
Keep it appropriate.
Keep it family friendly. Then we're going to say the font is also our existing font, Luckiest Guy. So circle select to pick the font. And the font size, we're going to go with 50. The alignments are going to be center and middle under paragraph. And I'm going to scroll down and choose white from the color picker, just like before. And as before, we need a drop shadow, so we're going to add a component, and I've already typed it in, so I'm going to type in SHA, press return to add the shadow script. Yet again, I'm going to put in 2 and -2 just to accentuate the effect a little bit. So, one more time. In the text component, we've put in the text property game over. And we've used circle select to choose the font, Luckiest Guy. We've set the font size to 50 alignment to middle and center, so it's just totally in the center. And we've set the color to white, as well as adding a shadow component with -2, 2 and -2. Then, very importantly, we need to reorder how these are arranged. So this is a really important thing to learn about the new UI system. So what you may have noticed as of Unity 4.5 and now in Unity 4.6, the hierarchy doesn't show in A to Z order. You'll notice that things that are at H is below a Z. So the reason for that is that the UI system needs to use the hierarchy to order its render order. So the way that this works, if you're used to Photoshop, you have to kind of think backwards. The lowermost child object is rendered in front of everything else. So currently we have damage image at the bottom, followed by health UI rendered on top of that, followed by score text, screen fader, then game over text. However, we don't want it in that order. We want our health UI to be at the bottom, so that when we fade in this blue screen, it obscures or renders in front of that health UI. You don't need to know that you had no health left when you died, because that's pretty obvious. That's why you died. So we're going to drag and drop these to reorder. You need to be kind of careful with this and just watch me do it first, because it can be a bit clunky. So what I want you to do is just watch for a second. So what I'm going to do is move my health UI to above. So I don't want to accidentally drop onto something else like this. I want to drop it so that it has the line and the small circle, and drop it above. And I'll slowly get these into the right order. So with the screen fader, that needs to be the third thing. So I'm going to drag that between these two, so the line shows up. And then game over text and score text should be at the end. So the health UI will render first. Then when we fade in and the damage image is next, that's intermittently happening, so it doesn't matter too much. The screen fader needs to obscure both of those by fading in, and we'll finish the game with game over text and score text still showing on top of that blue screen. So we've sorted that render order. Just to remind you of the render order, this is what it is. Health UI first, then damage image, screen fader, game over text, going down the list, so that the render order ends with score text. Again, it's cool that some of you are taking photos of the slides, but we will provide you a link to the PDF at the end, in case that helps. Okay, has anybody got any problems with the dragging, dropping? Cool. Wonderful.
They might be taking pictures so they can do cool Instagram filters.
I bet it's that.
Yeah.
It must be that.
I look good in sepia, just throwing that out there.
Okay. So the screen fader in the hierarchy, by default, needs to be transparent. We don't want to start the game with this blue obscuring everything. So I'm just going to save my scene real quick. And then with my screen fader reselected in the hierarchy, I'm going to click on the color block. And you'll see sliders at the bottom, RGB, red, green, blue, and A for alpha. So that's how you do transparent things. In Unity, you drag the alpha to 0. Then the same thing for the game over text. Select game over text, and in the color for the text component, open the block, set the alpha to 0. Drag the slider down to 0. So one more time. The color alpha on the image of screen fader needs to be 0, and the color alpha on game over text's text component also needs to be 0. So at the start of the game, these aren't there. And we're going to use animation in just a second to animate those in, make them look cool, and we're going to create a state machine for when the game ends. Everything is going to be wonderful. Okay, so because we previously used pre-animated FBX files, they came with an animator component already attached to them. We just needed to create the controller, the state machine, to apply to it. But you can use the animator with anything. A lot of people get confused because when we added the new animation system, it has a nickname which is Mechanim. And a lot of people think that that is only usable for character animation. It's not true at all. You can animate anything you want to. It's just a state machine you can apply animation clips to. So we're going to do exactly that with our UI right now.
Even the term animation is a little bit misleading because it makes you think that some form of motion is involved. And in fact, animation in this case can literally be the changing of anything. Positional information such as movement, but also colors, alphas, values, turning
Lights,
things on and off, literally anything you want.
So you can animate any public property of any component on any game object in Unity. So we're going to do that with the UI right now to give you an example of that. So because when we start adding animation, Unity is going to automatically assign the animator, i.e. the holder for the state machine, we need to select the right object. So we're going to choose the HUD canvas as the one we're going to start adding animation to. That way, when we add one clip, we'll be able to address any property of any of the child objects. That's really important. So with the HUD canvas selected, I want you to go to Window, Animation. Window Animation, not the animator, the actual timeline. It should look like this.
You can get there also by hitting Command 6 or Control 6.
And I'm going to drag this tab and dock it by the game view. Because when you're animating, you're mostly going to look at the scene view and you don't really need to worry about the game view, so I'm going to dock that in the same place. Then, if I don't already have a clip made, as soon as I add a curve, so adding curve basically means add a property that I want to animate of anything that's attached to the game object currently selected. So I click Add Curve, and Unity's like, whoa, you don't have an animation yet. What are you talking about?
You don't even have an animator.
Yeah, we don't even have
Way
anything
too early
set
for
up.
any of that.
Yeah. So it's telling me to just chill out, make an animation clip, then we can carry on. So it pops up a Create New Animation box. So because we've made that animation folder before we started, I'm going to select that as the place to put it. And I'm going to name my new clip Game Over Clip, like that. Press Save. So just to remind you, we've reselected the HUD canvas, we've opened the animation window. Clicking Add Curve is really important because it is allowing us to pick a property we're going to animate. We haven't done that yet because Unity said, hey, you need to have a clip with storing this information in. So we've just saved that clip and named it. So now, when we switch back to Unity, you'll see that the animation window is in record mode. The record mode button is highlighted, and it's asking us which property we'd like to animate.
It's worth noting right now that it is in fact in record mode, so anything you do in the scene view or the inspector is going to get recorded. So don't just like, hey, let's just start clicking a bunch of stuff, because it's going to start recording whatever you're doing, and will eventually screw a lot of stuff up. So just be careful. It is watching what you're doing right now, right? And you need to be careful exactly the things that you touch. And a real quick, easy way, too, to know if you're in record mode is you see the play icons at the top are red. That means you are in record mode, which means anything you're doing right now is being recorded. Right? Now that's not like a weird Big Brother kind of way. That's just if you change stuff, it's going to think you intended for that to be part of the animation.
So the record mode, there's a couple of different ways to work with this window. We're going to work in a very specific way, but there's a more kind of freestyle way where you can move the playhead along, change your property, and then it's going to get recorded straight into your animation. We'll do a little bit of that, and we'll do a little bit of filling it in manually. So, like I said, adding curve is choosing a property that you want to animate. So the list here shows me, first of all, the components attached to the game object we're animating. So there's a rect transform, there's a canvas, there's the graphic raycaster, the canvas group, and now it's added also an animator component because we're going to drive this with a state machine. Unity knows that's the way it needs to work, so it's added it for us. It also, very helpfully, created an animator controller asset for it and assigned it for us as well. Magical how it does all of those things for us. So now we also get the child objects. So all of these things that are attached to HUD canvas are also animatable. So what we're going to do is add a number of properties that we want to animate. So the first one we want to animate is the game over text. We want to make that fade in. So if you collapse, expand, I keep getting the wrong way around. expand game over text, and then expand the text component and click the plus icon for color. So you can see color here, click the plus icon, and you will get some keyframes added in at 0 and at 1 second. Yep, sure. And you also get the properties of that particular thing. So I'm going to do that one more time. So we have add curve shown up. I expand game over text, expand the text component, and I click the plus icon to the right of color. So it can be confusing the first time you do it, but once you get the hang of adding these properties, hopefully all will become clear. And I'm going to repeat this process for the next few properties, so you'll get to practice it right now. So next, I'm going to add another curve. I'm going to, this time, go to game over text, rect transform, and scale. Add a property for that. Then, screen fader, and I'm going to put the list back up that I'm saving here, so don't worry too much. Screen fader, image, color. So these are all things that we want to animate. Remember, we're animating in the alpha of the screen fader. We're going to animate the fading in of the word game over on the text, and we're also going to scale it. We're going to make it bounce when it comes in, so we're going to use scale for that. Finally, score text, we're just going to shrink down a little bit when the game is over. So we're going to add one more curve, score text, rect transform, scale. And the last thing I'm going to do, and I will reiterate this on the slides in one moment, is to select the topmost keyframe of the end keyframes. So what you can see is there's an empty row in your list of curves. Now what that does is it allows you to grab all of them that are in line. So I can click on my top keyframe here. If you just watch for a second, I can drag this back to frame 30 and let go. That will shorten the entire animation. So I'm grabbing this top one, and that's pulling all of the end keyframes for my animation to frame 30. So let's just reiterate the particular properties that we chose there. We added one curve for game over text, the text component color property. We added a curve for game over text, rect transform component scale property. A curve for screen fader image color property, and a curve for the score text rect transform scale property. And finally, we've moved all of the end keyframes to frame 30 so as to shorten the animation in its entirety.
Again, remember, you're in record mode. If you ever see another curve that's not one of those in this window, it recorded something else, and raise your hand, all right, because you don't want that.
Okay, so now we're going to actually start animating. So when you move your mouse over this actual timeline here, where I'm moving my mouse now, you can drag around, and you'll see the red line, that's the playhead, moving around. I'm going to move to frame 20. You can see here that the number that you're currently on is represented. So if I want to move to frame 20, I can drag, or I can type in here frame 20. So I can move to frame 20, and then I want to create a keyframe for the game over text scale. So I'm going to drag this divider so that I can see the end of that property. So the line between the list of curves and the timeline itself can be dragged to expand it. So drag that to the right. Game over text rect transform scale is the first one. I select the property so it's highlighted in blue, and I press K to make a new keyframe, or I can use this button here to add a keyframe as well.
You can also just double click in that row.
A word? I did not know that. Cool. I'm learning. That's good.
What's the learn team, right?
Yeah. Okay, so once I've done that, I can move to frame 0 and expand this. And what you'll see is that I've got 1, 1, 1. So when we start off, the scale is all at 1. But we want it to kind of increase from 0 scale and bounce up and then shrink back down. So drag the playhead back to 0, frame 0. Then I'm going to enter in 0, 0, 0 in the scale property. So if you expand game over text rect transform scale, you can click in those boxes and type in 0 and hit return. So what you'll notice if you then drag the playhead is that that rect transform is increasing. We haven't animated the alpha yet, but you can see the rect of the box is popping up as I drag over those. So just to run you through that last part again, I've moved the playhead to 020. I select rect transform scale on the left from the list of properties that we've already added. So it's highlighted in blue. I press K to add a keyframe or click the add keyframe button. Then I've dragged that red playhead back to 0 and selected game over text rect transform scale, expanded that and typed in 0 into all the properties. What I want you to notice as well is that we can also address this using the inspector. So anything that you've added as a curve will appear with a red animation highlight. So I can set them there as well. It's exactly the same as doing it in the animation window.
And also remember those values get added to the keyframes exactly where that red line is.
Also, I realized you couldn't see that, so I'm going to show you that one more time.
Right.
So the game over text rect transform scale, with that selected, I could also use the inspector. When we're in record mode, anything that's set up for animation, anything we've added as a curve in the list, is highlighted in red. So you can see that change as I drag in the inspector. So, anybody got problems with that bit? Okay, cool. The next thing we're going to do is go to that frame 20 where we've added that new keyframe. And because we're in record mode, I can go to the inspector and type 1.2 for all axes. 1.2 for the scale of all of those. So where it's red and says 1, or whatever it happens to say at frame 20, replace that with 1.2. So what that's doing, if I drag now, is it's popping up and then bouncing back down. So at frame 20, it's a scale of 1.2, and then we know that it's a scale of 1 at the end. So move the playhead to frame 20, set the scale to 1.2, and then you should see that it's popping up. Then, to finish this off, we're moving our playhead to frame 30. Again, please make sure that you're on that frame. So frame 30 is represented in this box. And then we need to just set a couple of other properties. So game over text, text color, we need the alpha to be 1. So I can expand that and set the alpha to 1. So I know that it's going to increase and become fully visible by frame 30. Then I'm going to close it back down. And with the screen fader, I want that to fade up to 1 as well. So I'm going to set the color.a property to 1, so the color alpha to 1. So as soon as I do it, I can see that the blue appears, so that's correct. And finally, score text at the end should be a scale of 0.8. So I'm going to set those in 0.8. So basically, we're just shrinking that down so it makes game over more prominent. We don't want them to be the same size, so we just scale one down as the game over text bounces up. If you've done those correctly, as you scrub over, it should be doing something like this. Score text is going down, the blue is fading up, game over is bouncing in and becoming more visible, whilst health UI is hiding or disappearing behind the screen fader. So I'm going to put those settings up on the PowerPoint. If anyone's got some issues, then they can raise their hand right now. We can come and give you some help. Okay, home stretch, people.
If you're falling asleep, do some jumping jacks.
Okay, so to switch back to Unity. Okay, so what we should have is our clip. And what you'll notice is that if we press play in the animation view, it's constantly looping. We don't want that to happen. But before we address that, what we're going to do is to move all of our keyframes to further on in the timeline, because we don't want this to happen as soon as the player dies, because we won't get to see the player death animation or the enemies changing to idle or anything like that. So what I want you to do is to watch what I'm doing briefly and then attempt it yourself. So you can zoom in the animation view. Use that if this next part proves difficult. You can use the scroll wheel. If you're on a Mac, you can use the 2-finger zoom. But what I'm going to do, just watch for a second, is to drag a box over all of my keyframes. Just watch for a second. Take your hand off the mouse. Talking to you, yes. Then drag all of them so that the first keyframe is on 1 second, 30 frames, or 90 frames in total. So move it like that. That way, it's going to start playing, you'll see the other animations in the game, and then this game over sequence is going to pop in. And finally, disable record mode. So switch off that record button. Okay, so you guys have a go now. Drag a box over all of those keyframes, drag any of them to move them all along so that the first one is at 130. Then make sure animation mode is switched off. Like I said, animation clips will loop. So the default in Unity is for looping animation. With something like this, you don't want it to loop. And the way that you address that is a little bit hidden away. It's not ideal, but it's attached to the clip. So we don't want this to loop, so what I'd like you to do is to go to the animation folder in the assets. Feel free to just shout. And select the game over clip that we just made. So that clip that we just made, the default at the top there is loop time. Uncheck loop time at the top of the inspector. Okay. Then reselect the HUD canvas, and you'll notice that Unity's added, like I mentioned before, the animator component, and it's created a HUD canvas animator controller. It names it after the game object that you started animating, basically. That's why it's the same name. So I can double-click that asset to open it in the animator window, the state machine. And that's exactly what we need to do. So double-click HUD canvas, the animator controller, not the game object, to open it in the animator window. So by default, it puts it in as a new state, and it puts that clip into that state as the default one to play, and it's just going to loop it. We've stopped it looping by unchecking loop time on the clip, but we also don't want it to play straight away. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to right-click, create state, empty. So we'll have a new gray state. This state doesn't have any animation clip assigned to it, so it effectively does nothing at all.
Go ahead and show them what it does right now, just so they know exactly why we're doing this. Go ahead and play.
Okay, yeah, so here's the problem that we're solving. As soon as I press play, it's game over. That's not good, right? You want people to have a bit more of a game-based experience. So what we're going to do is to solve that by stopping this being played by the animator straight away.
That's actually Dark Souls 3.
Is that
Yeah.
I haven't played that game. So we've made a new empty state, and we don't have any motion. So usually when you see a state, it has an animation clip in the motion field. We don't want that there. If we really wanted to, we can rename it empty, but we don't need to at all. But we do want that to be the default. So we're going to right-click on our new state, or our empty state, and choose Set as Default. Then we're going to create a transition, make transition to Game Over Clip state. And I'm going way ahead here. And we're going to select that transition, and you'll see that there's a condition called exit time, but we don't want that. We want to have an actual trigger to make this happen. So in our parameters, we're going to create a new trigger, and we're going to name this parameter game over, capital G and O. Remember, parameters are being addressed by a script, so it's very important that you get that naming correct. Capital G, capital O. Okay, so we're just going to jump into the PowerPoint. We don't want to lose anyone too far behind. So in the animator window, we created an empty state. You can rename it, like I said, at the top of the inspector. It's not important for this. We right-clicked that empty state and said set as default, though for some reason I haven't mentioned that. Maybe I do in a moment. We'll see. And then we've created a new animator trigger parameter and called it game over, capital G and O. Cool. Cool. Okie dokie. So we need to then set this condition, so make sure you've got your transition highlighted in blue, like this, and set the condition to game over. So as soon as that trigger is called from a script, it will fire us into that state. Cool. Then finally, nearly, we're going to select our HUD canvas in the hierarchy, and we're going to go to this scripts managers folder, and we're going to drag and drop Game Over Manager onto HUD canvas. So in scripts managers folder in the project, find Game Over Manager, drop it onto HUD canvas. Then we're going to double click this to open it up, but we're going to show you the PowerPoint real quick. So like I said, we created an empty state that's default so that the game doesn't immediately go to play that game over animation. We've selected the empty to game over clip transition, and the condition is set to the game over trigger parameter that we just made. We've selected the HUD canvas and assigned Game Over Manager to the HUD canvas game object. So the Game Over Manager is a script, and we're going to talk through that right now. James, over to you.
Okay, so as always, we're going to start with our public variables at the top of the script. We first need a reference to the player's health. So obviously the game ends when the players run out of health. We need to know when that is. So we need that reference. Next, we have a public float, which is the restart delay. So that's how long it's going to take once the player's died before we restart. So next, we have our private variables. We've got an animator reference, obviously, because we need to set the animator's trigger parameter, and a timer for that restart delay. So in our awake function, we're going to set up the reference as we have done before using getComponent. And then in update, we're going to check if the player has run out of health, if he's got less than or equal to 0 health. So if he has, he's dead. So we're going to set the animator trigger parameter to game over. We're going to set that, and it'll trigger that animation. We're then going to start the restart timer. So we're going to start counting up that timer. And once that exceeds the restart delay, so when the restart timer is increased enough that it is greater than 5 seconds, then we're going to call application.loadLevel. So that's just going to reload the scene because we've passed in the loaded level. So yeah.
So usually you can write in a string, so you might say level 01, and you add it to the build settings. But you can also, if you're reloading the exact same scene, you can use this little shortcut called loaded level, which is the one that's currently already there. Cool. So it's a very simple script, just a way to count up to a particular point if you've run out of health, whilst also triggering the animation of game over to appear on the screen. Real quick,
go ahead and zoom in right in that if block there. Sure. The update. So you might, if you're particularly keen with code, you might notice that once the player's health is below 0, thus the player is dead, every single update we are counting down or counting up some time, and every single update we're saying anim.set trigger game over. So you might be thinking, isn't just the game over animation just going to keep flashing and flashing and flashing? Because every single update we're setting that trigger over and over and over and over again, right? And you'd be right, that's exactly what's happening. But you're going to notice that the game over animation only plays a single time, doesn't just keep flashing over and over. And the reason is because in the animator controller, the game over state doesn't transition to itself. Once it's in the game over state, it has no way to get back into the game over state. So we can set this as many times as we want, the trigger as many times as we want. It's impossible for us, based on how we've set this up, to leave the game over state. So it won't play over and over and over again. We don't have to worry about that. So if you happen to be looking at the code and thinking, wait a minute, right? That's why. The logical transitions that we set up prevent that. They're one-way streets. We can get into that, we can't leave it.
And also the clip set not to loop, so it's not going to do it anyway. So going back to Unity, we are very finally going to select our HUD canvas, and you'll notice that the Game Over Manager needs to know about player health. So we need to assign the player to that public property, player health. So With my HUD canvas selected, I'm going to drag the player, drop it onto player health, so that it's got a reference to that. It can find out our health and therefore when we have died. So one more time, that last point, we're nearly there. We have added our Game Over Manager script, so we had a look at it, and we're dragging player from the hierarchy to the player health variable of that Game Over Manager. Finally, ladies and gentlemen, save your scene, pat yourselves on the back, and press play to shoot some zombie toys.
Now is the appropriate time to re-add the background music.
Yeah, now is the appropriate time to stop
Raise
playing,
cacophony.
select the background music,
Cry havoc and let loose, or let slip the dogs of war.
and do play on awake. Should probably sound like this. I'm going to turn that down so it's not quite so offensive.
Mm.